The loneliness was not merely a state of being, but a physical weight, a heavy garment she wore draped over her wide hips and heavy shoulders. She had long ago accepted the shape of her life, resigning herself to the quiet, dusty corners of the world where women like her were meant to fade. She was a widow, a title that felt less like a tragedy and more like a final, unyielding categorization. The town saw her as sturdy, capable, and profoundly uninteresting. She saw herself much the same way. When her husband passed, the grief had been sharp, but the aftermath had been a long, flat plane of gray existence. She had made a promise to herself, whispered into the cold darkness of her empty bedroom, that she would never subject herself to the vulnerability of hoping for love again. Love was for women who were delicate, women who needed protecting, women who did not possess hands calloused by labor and shoulders broadened by carrying burdens alone. She was not meant to be seen, she was meant to endure. That was the lie she needed to survive, a lie like a lantern in a dark room, casting just enough light to keep her from tripping over her own despair. It was this very lie that propelled her into the kitchen on a Tuesday morning, tying a faded apron around her waist with deliberate, sharp movements. She was going to bake a pie. It meant nothing, she told herself. It was simply a neighborly gesture, the kind of practical, unremarkable thing a sturdy widow did when a new man bought the derelict ranch 2 miles down the road. The act of measuring flour, the familiar grounding scent of cinnamon and apples, the rhythmic motion of rolling out the dough, these were anchors. They kept her mind from drifting into the dangerous waters of curiosity. She pressed the edges of the crust with her thumb, forming perfect uniform flutes, pouring her unacknowledged nervous energy into the task. The pie was not a welcome. It was an obligation. It was a shield forged of sugar and fruit, designed to prove that she was functioning, that she was fine, that she was entirely untouched by the sudden arrival of a stranger in their insular valley. When she finally walked the dusty path to the neighboring property, the pie resting warm and heavy in a basket over her arm, she saw him before he saw her. He was standing near the dilapidated barn, wiping grease from his hands with a ragged cloth. He did not look like the wealthy speculators who occasionally passed through, nor did he possess the arrogant swagger of the local hands. He looked weathered. He looked like a man who had walked a very long way and found no comfort at the end of it. His shoulders were bowed not by weakness, but by a weariness that seemed woven into the fabric of his shirt. When he turned and noticed her, he did not startle. He simply stopped, his gaze locking onto hers. His eyes were the color of slate, tired but careful, assessing her without the immediate dismissal she was so accustomed to receiving from men. There was no performative charm in his posture, only a quiet, grounded stillness that made the breath catch in her throat. She approached, her heavy boots kicking up small clouds of dust. She offered the basket without a smile, her face a mask of polite indifference. Inside the basket, tucked beneath a checkered cloth, was a small note she had written identifying herself and her property line, a practical necessity to ensure he knew who to return the basket to. He took the offering, his large scarred fingers brushing the woven wood. He lifted the cloth and extracted the small slip of paper. As his eyes scanned her handwriting, something imperceptible shifted in his face. It was not a grand reaction. It was a tightening around the eyes, a sudden absolute stillness that seemed to suck the air from the space between them. He stared at the looping letters of her script for a fraction of a second too long, a silent tremor passing through his jaw. He looked up at her, the careful neutrality of his expression fracturing just enough to reveal a profound, hidden history. He did not thank her immediately. Instead, he spoke in a voice that was low and rough, like stones grinding together beneath a river current. He asked if she would stay for a cup of coffee. It was a simple question, yet it shattered the expected social script of their town, where widows were thanked politely and sent on their way. She should have declined. She should have retreated to the safety of her quiet house and her immovable resolve. But the way he looked at her, not as a sturdy fixture of the landscape, but as a person standing directly in front of him, sparked a small, terrifying act of rebellion in her chest. She nodded. She was not nervous. She was not hopeful. She was simply stepping off the edge of the map she had drawn for herself. The coffee was bitter, boiled over a fire in a dented tin pot, but she drank it without complaint as they sat on 2 overturned crates near the porch. The silence that stretched between them was not the awkward, jagged gap of 2 strangers struggling to find common ground. It was a shared thing, a comfortable expanse that required no filling. She watched the dust motes dance in the shaft of sunlight breaking through the ruined porch roof, feeling a strange, settling calm. It was a recognition, a quiet acknowledgement that they both understood the value of words left unsaid. This comfort, this immediate unspoken understanding, felt dangerously familiar to her, pulling her mind back across the span of 2 years to a decision born of profound, suffocating isolation. 2 years ago, when the silence of her house had threatened to crush her, she had answered a discreet advertisement in a regional agricultural paper. It was a request for correspondence, placed by a man who signed himself only as W. The advertisement had asked for plain speaking and honest words, nothing more. In a moment of weakness, shrouded by the anonymity of distance and ink, she had written back. What had begun as a tentative exchange of weather reports and crop yields had slowly, inextricably deepened into something entirely different. Through the letters, they had built a sanctuary of paper and ink. W was a man haunted by past failures, a man who wrote with a stark, unadorned honesty that pierced straight through her defenses. In return, she gave him the truth of her own life. She wrote about the tangible presence of her loneliness, about the fear of being entirely erased from the world, about the deep, secret shame of feeling utterly unlovable because of the breadth of her shoulders and the plainness of her face. They never exchanged real names, never described their physical appearances, guarding their anonymity fiercely because it was the very thing that allowed them to be so painfully vulnerable. The letters were a lifeline, the only place where she felt truly, completely seen. She pulled her mind back to the present, focusing on the man sitting across from her. He was watching her, his slate eyes steady. He stood up slowly, setting his tin cup down, and pointed toward the road where her wagon had been giving her trouble the previous week. He mentioned he had some spare grease and a few heavy bolts that might fix the alignment issues she had been struggling with. He did not offer to do it for her out of a sense of misplaced chivalry. He offered the materials and his assistance as a practical partnership. He was helpful without being asked, and without the condescension that usually accompanied offers of aid to a widow. He demonstrated his character through action, moving with a quiet, deliberate efficiency that spoke volumes more than any boastful claim. Their interaction was interrupted by the crunch of approaching buggy wheels. It was Mrs. Gable, the town's most prolific conduit of information and judgment. The older woman reined in her horse, her eyes darting between the empty pie basket and the two of them sitting in comfortable proximity. Mrs. Gable's smile was sharp, her greeting laced with a thinly veiled curiosity that felt like an intrusion. She commented on how quickly the new neighbor was making acquaintances, her tone implying a breach of the unspoken rules of mourning and widowhood that she expected the protagonist to uphold indefinitely. The neighbor represented the suffocating social pressures of the town, the collective gaze that demanded she remain invisible and static. But as Mrs. Gable spoke, the male lead simply stood beside the protagonist, his presence a solid, unyielding barrier against the older woman's barbed words. He did not defend her, knowing she did not need it. He merely existed as a unified front, making Mrs. Gable's gossip feel suddenly small and irrelevant. 2 days later, she found him on her property line, hammering a loose rail back into the fence that separated her land from the communal grazing pasture. When she approached, demanding to know why he was doing her chores, he did not look up from his work. He simply said he was fixing it because she had brought him a pie. It was a quid pro quo of kindness, a practical exchange that bypassed the need for emotional declarations. It established a pattern. He would chop a cord of wood and leave it by her shed. She would leave a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth on his porch. They were circling each other, communicating through the silent language of shared labor and mutual care. It was during one of these quiet exchanges, when he had come to her kitchen to return a mended harness, that the delicate fabric of their real-world interaction nearly snagged on the hidden truth. He noticed a leather-bound journal resting on her table, an inkwell open beside it. He paused, his hand hovering over the worn cover. He remarked, his voice perfectly level, that he admired people who could organize their thoughts on paper, admitting that he often found it easier to write his mind than to speak it. She froze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She replied, choosing her words with agonizing care, that sometimes paper was the only place where a person was allowed to be exactly who they were. For a moment, their eyes met, and the air between them grew thick with an unspoken resonance. They were both alluding to their secret correspondences, standing inches apart, entirely unaware that the person they were speaking of was the person they were speaking to. The town's annual harvest gathering forced them into the crowded, noisy center of the community. She had intended to sit on the periphery as she always did, a ghost haunting the edges of the celebration. But he found her. He did not ask her to dance, nor did he attempt to draw her into the center of the room. He simply brought 2 plates of food and sat down beside her on a bench near the open doors. They existed beside each other, an island of quiet amidst the swirling music and laughter. It felt dangerously comfortable. She realized, with a sudden spike of panic, that the physical weight of her loneliness was gone, replaced by the solid, reassuring warmth of his shoulder inches from hers. Later that evening, the local school teacher called for the traditional reading of poems and passages to mark the end of the harvest. The protagonist, emboldened by a strange, flickering courage she did not fully understand, stood up. She had brought a small piece of paper with her, a short poem about enduring winter storms that had been inspired by one of W's most poignant letters. As she read the words aloud, her voice steady and clear, she looked toward the back of the room. He was standing near the door. As the final lines left her lips, lines that mirrored the exact phrasing W had used to describe the frost on his own windows, his reaction was instantaneous. He went completely still. The careful neutrality of his face vanished, replaced by an expression of absolute shattering shock. The color drained from his skin. He did not move, he did not speak, but in that suspended second, she saw a revelation crash over him with the force of a falling timber. He knew. The realization struck him like a physical blow. He stepped out into the cool night air, his lungs struggling to draw breath. The woman reading the poem, the sturdy, quiet widow who baked pies out of obligation and spoke with the exact same cadence as the letters he kept tied in a ribbon beneath his bed, she was his correspondent. She was the woman who held his darkest truths, his deepest shames. His mind spun wildly, grappling with the impossible reality of it. But beneath the shock lay a rising, suffocating terror. He knew his past. He knew the things he had done, the failures he had run from, the reasons he had sought a sturdy, capable bride who asked no questions. If she was the woman from the letters, then she was the woman he had bared his soul to, and yet she still did not know the full, ugly truth of his history. His presence in this town was not an accident. It was a retreat from a ghost that was still hunting him, and now that ghost threatened to drag her down with him. The threat materialized the very next afternoon. She was in town purchasing supplies when she was cornered by Mr. Vance, the wealthy representative of a sprawling land conglomerate that had been quietly, ruthlessly buying up vulnerable properties in the valley. Mr. Vance was a man who operated through veiled threats and financial pressure, a quiet tyrant whose power lay in social manipulation rather than overt violence. He tipped his hat to her, his smile not reaching his cold, calculating eyes. He began asking pointed questions about her new neighbor, inquiring about the man's finances, his character, his history. When she offered nothing but terse ignorance, Mr. Vance leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a smooth, dangerous murmur. He suggested that it would be very unfortunate if a respectable widow were to entangle herself with a man whose past was catching up to him, a man who had left a trail of ruin in his wake. It was a warning, sharp and clear. That evening he came to her house. He did not knock but stood on the porch until she opened the door, sensing his presence. He looked older, the weariness in his shoulders more pronounced than ever. He sat at her kitchen table and, looking at his scarred hands rather than her face, offered a partial confession. He told her that he had a difficult past, that he had made enemies who were powerful and unforgiving, and that Mr. Vance was one of them. He admitted that Vance had a reason to target him, a reason rooted in a dispute over land and stolen livelihoods in a territory 3 states over. But he stopped there. He did not tell her the full story, and more importantly, he did not tell her that he knew she was the woman he wrote to. He was trying to protect her by keeping her at a distance, trying to sever the connection before it could be used against her. 2 days later, the mail coach arrived. Among her sparse deliveries was a letter addressed in the familiar, jagged script of W. She took it to her kitchen, her hands trembling slightly as she broke the seal. The letter was longer than usual, the handwriting rushed and frantic. In it, W detailed a history of failure. He wrote of a land company that had used him as a pawn to cheat honest families out of their properties, of his agonizing realization of his complicity, and of his desperate, cowardly flight from the mess he had helped create. He wrote of his deep, abiding shame and his fear that the men he had crossed were finally closing in. The details aligned perfectly, horrifyingly, with the partial confession the man in her kitchen had made just 48 hours prior. She lay awake that night, the darkness pressing down on her as the pieces of the puzzle slammed together in her mind. She thought of the first day, his reaction to her handwriting on the note in the pie basket. She thought of the conversation about the journal, the shared silences, the poem at the harvest gathering, and the absolute stillness that had overtaken him. She traced the lines of his careful, quiet actions in the real world and matched them against the raw, bleeding honesty of W's letters. She moved from a stark, defensive no to a hesitant, terrifying but what if. The man who fixed her fence and the man who held her deepest secrets were one and the same. He did not wait for her to come to him. The next morning he appeared at her door, his face pale, his eyes devoid of their usual careful guard. He looked entirely defeated. He stepped into the kitchen and stood before her, refusing to take a seat. He looked directly into her eyes, his voice breaking as he spoke the words that would destroy the fragile peace between them. "I am W," he said, the admission hanging in the air like an executioner's blade. He braced himself for her shock, for her anger, for her immediate demand that he leave her property. Her response was the ultimate subversion of his expectations. She did not gasp. She did not retreat. She stood firm, her wide shoulders squared, and looked back at him with a gaze that was devastatingly clear. "I know," she said quietly. The breath left him in a rush. But the relief he might have felt was instantly extinguished by the profound sorrow in her eyes. She did not yell, but her words carried a weight that cut deeper than any shout. She told him that her betrayal was not rooted in his deception about his identity, nor in the ugly history he had confessed. Her betrayal was rooted in the loss of her sanctuary. She had trusted a stranger with the ugliest, most vulnerable parts of herself because he was safe, because he was distant, because he could not look at her broad hips and plain face and judge her unworthy. By bringing those secrets into the light of her kitchen, by merging the safe stranger with the man standing before her, he had stripped her of her only refuge. She demanded time. She told him not to write, not to visit, not to fix her fences. She needed to mourn the loss of the only place she had ever felt truly seen, before she could decide if she could bear to be seen in the harsh light of reality. For a week, the silence between their properties was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating thing. During that week, she did not bake. She did not tend the garden. She sat at her kitchen table and systematically reread all 47 letters she had received from W over the past 2 years. She read them not for romance, but with a forensic intensity, searching for the real shape of the man who had penned them. She stripped away the anonymity and applied the words to the man with the slate eyes and the scarred hands. She realized, with a slow, building clarity, that he had never lied in his letters. The shame was real. The longing for redemption was real. The profound respect for her mind and her endurance was real. He had been consistently honest in his writing, even when he lacked the courage to be honest in the flesh. On the 8th day, she put on her heaviest boots, wrapped her shawl tightly around her shoulders, and walked the 2 miles down the dusty road to his property. She found him in the barn, sitting on an overturned bucket, staring blankly at the dirt floor. He looked up, his expression guarded, expecting a final dismissal. She walked right up to him, stopping only when she was close enough to see the exhaustion etched deep into the lines of his face. "I am not here to forgive you yet," she said, her voice ringing with quiet authority. "Forgiveness is a luxury we do not have time for. I am here because I have been thinking, and I refuse to be a casualty in a war you brought to my doorstep." This shifted the earth beneath his feet. She was not acting as a wounded lover. She was acting as a partner, a strategist evaluating a battlefield. She demanded the rest of the truth, the parts he had omitted from both his confession and his letters. He gave it to her. He explained the exact mechanics of how Mr. Vance and the land conglomerate operated, how they forged deeds and intimidated witnesses. Then, he revealed his final, most dangerous secret. He had not just fled, he had taken the ledger. He possessed documentary evidence, contracts, forged signatures, records of bribes that could dismantle the entire operation and send Vance to federal prison. He had kept it hidden for years, paralyzed by the fear that bringing it forward would expose his own complicity and result in his own ruin. The antagonist made his first physical move that night. It was not a dramatic assault, but a quiet, deniable act of intimidation designed to build a narrative of incompetence and unreliability around the male lead. The male lead's best draft horse was stolen from its paddock, the gate left swinging in the wind. When the sheriff was called, Vance's men were conveniently present in town, planting seeds of doubt, suggesting that a man who could not even secure his own livestock was likely deeply in debt and looking to collect insurance money. It was a calculated effort to destroy his reputation before he could ever stand as a credible witness. The protagonist saw the trap closing. She knew that if Vance's men searched his property and found the ledger, they would destroy it and likely kill him in the process. She made a decision that terrified her in its absolute finality. She demanded he give the ledger to her. She insisted on hiding the incriminating documents in her own home, beneath the floorboards of her pantry. When he protested, horrified at the danger she was inviting, she cut him off with a fierce, immovable resolve. "It is not your risk to give or withhold," she stated, her eyes flashing. "It is mine, and I am choosing to take it. I am not a fragile thing to be shielded. I am the woman who wrote those letters, and you will trust me now as you trusted me then." It was an active choice, a complete rejection of her passive, invisible existence. The escalation was swift. A week later, a man was brought into town by Mr. Vance, a stranger with slick hair and a desperate look in his eye. He filed a formal, sworn statement with the local magistrate, claiming that the male lead had defrauded him of a massive sum of money back east and had violently threatened him to keep quiet. It was a complete fabrication, a false legal threat designed to legitimize a warrant for his arrest and the seizure of his property. The net was drawing tight. Faced with the imminent threat of armed deputies arriving with a fraudulent warrant, the male lead panicked. His instinct to protect her overrode his respect for her agency. He came to her house under the cover of darkness, a saddled horse waiting in the trees. He told her she had to leave, to pack a bag and go to her sister's house 3 towns over until he could sort the mess out. He was trying to push her out of the blast radius. She refused, her anger colder and sharper than the night air. She stood in the doorway, blocking his exit. "You do not get to decide now, when things are getting difficult, that my involvement is no longer acceptable," she hissed, her voice vibrating with restrained fury. "You wanted a partner who could handle the heavy lifting. Do not insult me by trying to pack me away like delicate china the moment the house catches fire." Her refusal snapped him out of his panic. They needed a plan, and they needed it before morning. They realized that the local magistrate was in Vance's pocket. Their only hope was the circuit judge, a man known for his rigid, incorruptible adherence to the law, who was currently holding court in the county seat 40 miles away. They decided to send the ledger to him, along with a sworn affidavit from the male lead detailing the entire conspiracy. They could not trust the male, nor could they risk either of them leaving town, as their absence would trigger immediate suspicion. They entrusted the package to a young, fiercely loyal farmhand from a neighboring property whose family had been quietly aided by the protagonist during a harsh winter years prior. The boy rode out before dawn. Vance was not a fool. He sensed the shift in the wind. The next afternoon, he sent his chief enforcer, a hulking man with cold eyes, to the protagonist's house. The man did not break anything. He simply sat on her porch railing and delivered a message. He targeted her specific vulnerabilities, the deep-seated fears she had harbored for years. He told her that the town was already talking, that her reputation as a respectable widow was hanging by a thread. He suggested that if she continued to support the male lead, the narrative would be simple. She was a desperate, lonely woman being used by a conman who saw her only as convenient. He threatened her with total social ruin, guaranteeing that she would be ostracized, isolated, and entirely alone once again. The threat was designed to break her, to force her back into the quiet, invisible corner she had occupied for so long. Instead, it solidified her resolve into something unbreakable. The fear of loneliness was powerful, but the righteous anger burning in her chest was stronger. She realized that Vance's power relied entirely on silence, on the isolation of his victims. She used her status as an underestimated, invisible widow to her advantage. Over the next 2 days, she systematically visited 4 other families in the valley, families who were struggling, families who had been pressured by Vance, families who felt entirely alone. She sat in their kitchens, drank their tea, and told them the truth. She told them they were not fighting a legitimate businessman, but a criminal enterprise. She asked them to stand with her. She did not demand courage. She simply offered to share the weight of the risk. The climax arrived on a sweltering Thursday morning. The local magistrate, acting on Vance's instructions, convened a public hearing in the town hall to review the sworn statement against the male lead, a preliminary step towards seizing his assets. The room was packed, the air thick with tension and the smell of sweat and dust. Vance sat in the front row, looking supremely confident, his false witness trembling slightly beside him. The male lead stood at the front, his posture rigid, his face an unreadable mask, bracing for the destruction of his life. As the magistrate began to read the fabricated charges, preparing to strike the gavel and finalize the ruin, the protagonist stood up. The scraping of her chair against the wooden floor sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. She did not ask for permission to speak. She walked down the center aisle, her heavy boots sounding a steady, rhythmic march. She reached the front and turned to face the room. She drew a piece of paper from her pocket. It was not the ledger that was with the circuit judge, but a letter. It was a letter written by the widow of a man Vance had ruined 3 years prior, a woman who had been a part of the original land theft. The protagonist had tracked her down through her own correspondence network. She read the letter aloud, her voice ringing clear and true, exposing Vance's exact methodology, naming the false witness as a known perjurer on Vance's payroll. Vance sprang to his feet, his face purple with rage, shouting objections and demanding she be removed. But before the magistrate could act, the sound of multiple chairs scraping echoed through the hall. The heads of the 4 families the protagonist had visited stood up. They did not shout. They simply stated, one by one, that they too had been threatened by Vance, that they recognized his tactics, and that they stood by the widow's words. The room erupted into chaos. The doors at the back of the hall banged open. The young farmhand stood there, chest heaving, pointing outside. Through the doors walked the circuit judge, flanked by 3 federal marshals. The judge had received the ledger. He strode to the front of the room, his presence silencing the clamor instantly. He slammed his hand down on the magistrate's desk, halting the proceedings. He announced that a federal inquiry had been opened based on documentary evidence of widespread fraud and extortion, and he ordered the immediate arrest of Mr. Vance and his associates. The false case against the male lead collapsed instantly into dust. The tyrant was broken, not by violence, but by the undeniable weight of the truth brought into the light. In the immediate aftermath, as the hall cleared and the marshals led Vance away in irons, the protagonist and the male lead found themselves alone in the empty, echoing space of the room. The external threat was neutralized, the adrenaline draining away to leave a profound, ringing exhaustion. He looked at her, standing by the rows of empty chairs. He did not approach her immediately. He waited, respecting the boundary she had drawn weeks ago. He looked at her not as a savior and not as a sturdy, convenient bride, but as the most terrifyingly magnificent thing he had ever seen. He crossed the room slowly, stopping a few feet away. He took a breath, the air trembling in his chest. He finally spoke the words he had been too cowardly to say in his letters and too ashamed to say in her kitchen. "I wanted someone who could handle the heavy lifting," he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I wanted a partner who wouldn't need me, but you are the only thing I have ever been truly afraid of losing. I do not deserve you, but I will spend the rest of my life trying to." She looked at him, seeing the penitent wanderer, the honest man who had finally found the courage to match his words with his actions. The anger and betrayal that had shielded her heart had burned away, leaving only the quiet, enduring truth of their connection. She looked at his scarred hands, and then up into his slate eyes. "I told you I needed time," she said softly. He nodded, bracing for a continued separation. She closed the distance between them, reaching out to take his hand, her fingers tracing the rough calluses. "I have had enough time," she finished, her grip tightening on his. It was not a grand, dramatic embrace. It was a solid, grounding connection, 2 people choosing to bear the weight of the world together. 3 months passed, bringing the crisp, biting air of autumn to the valley. The fallout from the hearing had reshaped the town. Vance's conglomerate was dismantled, the stolen properties slowly returning to their rightful owners through the courts. The town, fickle in its judgments, had shifted its gaze. The male lead was no longer viewed with suspicion. He was treated with a cautious, growing respect. The gossips, led by a chastened Mrs. Gable, found new, less dangerous subjects to discuss. The protagonist found that she was no longer invisible. When she walked into the mercantile, people met her eyes, acknowledging the quiet strength that had saved them all. On a Tuesday morning, exactly like the one that had started it all, she walked out to her porch to find a small, folded piece of paper tucked under a stone on the railing. It was written in the familiar, jagged script of W. She opened it, a small smile touching the corners of her mouth. It was not a confession of past sins, nor a plea for understanding. It was a formal, painfully sincere request. He wrote that they had done everything backwards. They had shared their souls before their names, fought a war before they had shared a meal in peace. He asked for permission to court her properly. He wrote that he wanted to choose her out loud in the daylight, without shadows and without secrets. She did not write a reply. She folded the letter, placed it in her pocket, and walked down the dusty road toward his property. The heavy, suffocating garment of her loneliness was entirely gone, replaced by a light, steady warmth in her chest. She reached his cabin and found him standing by the porch watching the road, waiting for her answer. He did not ask. She did not speak. She simply walked up the steps, took his hand, and together they went inside, closing the door on the world behind them. This was not a love story born of a sudden, breathless glance across a crowded room. It was a story built on the slow, agonizing work of being known. It was forged in the quiet spaces between words, in the practical acts of survival, and in the terrifying courage required to hand your darkest truths to another person and trust them not to drop them. It was the story of a man who only wanted a bride big enough to handle a ranch alone, and the woman who taught him that the heaviest burden a person can carry is a secret, and the greatest relief is the act of telling the truth to someone who is finally truly listening. The silence in the cabin was different now. It was no longer the heavy, expectant quiet of two people guarding their secrets, nor the tense stillness of a battlefield waiting for the first shot. It was the warm, resonant hum of a shared life beginning to take root. She stood by the window, looking out over the land that stretched between their two properties. The fences were mended, the livestock grazing peacefully in the fading afternoon light. He came up behind her, his presence a solid, grounding weight. He did not wrap his arms around her waist or pull her into a dramatic embrace. He simply stood beside her, their shoulders brushing, their hands resting on the wooden sill, fingers tangling together in a quiet, unhurried rhythm. "I thought I would have to sell the far pasture," he murmured, his voice rumbling in his chest, a sound she felt as much as heard. "To cover the legal fees from the hearing. The judge was fair, but the lawyers out east who had to untangle Vance's mess were not." She turned her head slightly, her gaze still fixed on the horizon. "You will do no such thing," she replied, her tone pragmatic and firm. "I have the savings from the last 3 harvests. We will pool it. The land stays whole." He looked at her then, a small, genuine smile breaking through the habitual seriousness of his face. "You'd make a terrifying general," he observed, his voice laced with that dry, understated irony she had come to recognize as his only form of humor. It was not a joke meant to elicit laughter, but a sincere acknowledgement of her formidable nature, a trait he clearly revered. "Someone has to ensure the supply lines are maintained," she countered smoothly, finally turning to meet his eyes. The slate gray of his gaze was warm, stripped of the exhaustion and weariness that had defined him for so long. She saw herself reflected there, not as a wide-hipped, plain-faced widow, but as a woman of immense value, a cornerstone upon which a life could be built. They spent the evening in the simple domestic rhythm of preparing a meal together. There was no need for the frantic, nervous energy that often accompanied new courtship. They had already survived the worst of each other. The mundane act of peeling potatoes and tending the fire felt like a profound luxury. She watched him move around her kitchen, for they had unspokenly decided that her house, with its sturdier roof and larger hearth, would be their center, and felt a deep, settling peace. He was careful, deliberate, his large hands handling the fragile crockery with a surprising gentleness. After supper, they sat by the fire. He pulled a small, leather-bound book from his pocket. It was not his ledger, nor was it the journal she had seen that day weeks ago. It was a new book, the pages crisp and blank. He opened it to the first page and held it out to her, along with a pen. "I don't want to stop writing to you," he said quietly, the firelight casting long shadows across his face. "Even if you are sitting right across from me. There are things I can only say in ink, and I want to know there is a place where you can still tell me the things you are too stubborn to say out loud." She took the book, her fingers tracing the smooth leather. It was a profound gesture, an acknowledgement that their history, however unconventional and fraught with deception, was the foundation of their love. He was not trying to erase W. He was inviting W into the light, integrating the vulnerable, poetic soul of the letters with the practical, scarred man sitting before her. She opened the book, dipped the pen in the inkwell resting on the side table, and wrote a single line on the first page. She did not show it to him immediately. She let the ink dry, the scratching sound loud in the quiet room. When she finally handed it back, he looked down at the page. In her steady, looping script, she had written, "The winter is long, but the house is warm, and I am no longer afraid of the snow." He read the words, his throat tightening. He closed the book gently and set it aside. He reached for her hands, pulling her up from her chair until she was standing before him. He looked up at her, his expression entirely unguarded, laying bare the depth of his devotion. "I will build you a new barn," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I will fix every fence on this property until they are strong enough to hold back a stampede. I will plant whatever you want to grow, and I will harvest it with you. But you must promise me one thing." She looked down at him, her heart expanding until she felt it might crack her ribs. "What?" she asked, her voice a soft breath. "Promise me you will never bake me a pie out of obligation again," he said, his eyes intensely serious. "If you bake, it is because you want to. If you stay, it is because you choose to. No more shields, no more lies to survive." A single tear, born not of melancholy but of overwhelming, luminous hope, escaped her eye and tracked down her cheek. She did not wipe it away. She let him see it. She let him see all of her. "I promise," she whispered. The days that followed fell into a steady, industrious rhythm. The joining of their properties was a massive undertaking, requiring them to tear down the boundary fence that had once separated them. They worked side by side, pulling the heavy posts from the earth, rolling up the barbed wire. It was grueling, physical labor, the kind of work that left their muscles aching and their hands blistered. But as they worked, they talked. They filled in the gaps of the 2 years they had spent writing to each other, connecting the abstract thoughts of their letters to the tangible realities of their lives. She learned about the specific shade of green the ocean turned just before a storm, a sight he had described in a letter from his wandering days. He learned about the precise, agonizing silence that had settled over her house the day her first husband had been buried, a silence she had only ever articulated on paper. They were mapping each other, exploring the terrain of their shared history with a newfound freedom. The town watched this integration with a mixture of curiosity and a strange, grudging respect. The narrative had shifted entirely. They were no longer the mysterious stranger and the invisible widow. They were a unified force, a formidable partnership that had stood against the most powerful man in the territory and won. When they rode into town together on a wagon for supplies, the deference shown to them was palpable. Mrs. Gable, who had once sought to diminish the protagonist with her barbed gossip, now went out of her way to offer polite, almost obsequious greetings. The protagonist accepted this change with her usual quiet dignity, neither gloating nor shrinking from the attention. She simply existed, finally allowing herself to take up space in the world. Winter arrived early that year, sweeping down from the mountains with a fierce, howling intensity. The snow piled high against the windows, sealing them inside the house. In the past, this kind of isolation would have triggered a deep, suffocating panic in her, a reminder of her profound aloneness. Now, it was a sanctuary. The house was indeed warm, heated by the massive wood stove and the constant, reassuring presence of the man she loved. They spent the long evenings by the fire, reading, talking, and writing in the leather-bound book. The book became a living document of their relationship, a place where they recorded their fears, their hopes, and the quiet, profound moments of their daily lives. He wrote about the way the firelight caught the red undertones in her hair. She wrote about the steady, rhythmic sound of his breathing as he slept, a sound that chased away the ghosts of her past. One evening, as the wind battered the heavy wooden shutters, he looked up from the book, his expression thoughtful. "I had a letter today," he said quietly, "from the circuit judge." She paused in her knitting, her hands stilling in her lap. The mention of the judge brought back the sharp, metallic taste of fear from the days of the hearing. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice steady but her heart beating a little faster. "No," he replied, shaking his head. "No problem. Vance was convicted. Federal prison, 20 years. The conglomerate is being dissolved. The judge wrote to inform me that the danger is officially past. He hesitated, looking down at his scarred hands. He also thanked me for the ledger. He said it was the key to breaking the entire operation." She felt a profound sense of relief wash over her, untying a knot in her chest she hadn't realized she was still carrying. "It is over then," she said softly. "It is over," he confirmed, looking up to meet her eyes. "The past is finally just the past." He stood up and crossed the room to where she sat. He knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his, completely ignoring the tangled yarn. He looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I came here looking for a fortress," he said, his voice raw and sincere. "I wanted a place to hide, and I wanted a woman strong enough to guard the gates while I hid behind her. It was a cowardly, selfish thing to want." "You were frightened," she replied gently, her thumbs tracing the lines of his knuckles. "Fear makes us want things we don't truly need. But I found you," he continued, his slate eyes shining in the firelight. "And you weren't a fortress. You were a lighthouse. You didn't hide me. You forced me to stand in the light. You made me brave enough to face the things I was running from. You saved my life, not by protecting me, but by demanding that I be worthy of you." She looked at him, her heart overflowing with a love so fierce and absolute it felt like a physical force. She leaned down and pressed her forehead against his, closing her eyes. "We saved each other," she whispered into the quiet space between them. "I was a ghost before you wrote to me. You gave me back my voice, and then you gave me back my life." The winter slowly gave way to a hesitant spring. The snow melted, turning the valley into a sea of deep, vibrant green. The work began anew, the endless cycle of planting and tending that defined their lives. But the labor was no longer a burden to be endured. It was a shared purpose, a testament to the life they were building together. They were married in a small, quiet ceremony in the town church, the same building where they had faced down Vance and his lies. The congregation was small, consisting only of the 4 families they had rallied, the young farmhand who had carried the ledger, and the circuit judge, who had traveled from the county seat to officiate. There was no grand fanfare, no lavish celebration. It was a solemn, joyful acknowledgement of a bond that had been forged in fire and sealed in ink. As they stood before the judge, their hands clasped tightly together, the protagonist felt a profound sense of rightness settle over her. She was not the delicate, fragile bride of romantic novels. She was wide-hipped, heavy-shouldered, and deeply, entirely loved. She looked at the man beside her, the penitent wanderer who had finally found his home, and knew that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Their life together was not without its hardships. There were droughts that threatened the crops, harsh winters that tested their endurance, and the inevitable, quiet sorrows that accompany any life fully lived. But they faced these challenges together, their partnership an immovable anchor in a turbulent world. Years later, when the town had grown and the memory of Mr. Vance was nothing more than a dusty footnote in the county records, a young woman came to their door. She was a reporter for a regional newspaper, writing a series of articles on the early settlers of the valley. She sat in their kitchen, a notebook resting on the table, and asked them the secret to their long, prosperous marriage. The male lead, his hair now threaded with silver, looked across the table at his wife. He smiled, that rare, genuine smile that still made her heart skip a beat. He did not speak of grand romance or unyielding passion. He spoke of the quiet, enduring things. "Honesty," he said simply, his voice carrying the weight of a lifetime of truth. "The courage to be entirely known, even when it is terrifying. And the willingness to listen when the person you love tells you who they truly are." The protagonist nodded in agreement, her hand resting over his on the scarred wood of the table. "And practical magic," she added, a twinkle of dry humor in her eyes. "Like knowing when to fix a fence and when to bake a pie." The reporter smiled, scribbling furiously in her notebook, entirely missing the profound private joke that passed between them. It didn't matter. The truth of their story belonged to them alone, recorded in the pages of a leather-bound book and etched into the very soil of the land they had saved together. As the reporter left, the sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across the valley. The protagonist and the male lead stood on their porch, watching the light fade from the sky. They were older now, their bodies bearing the marks of a life spent in hard labor and deep love. But as they stood together, their shoulders touching, their hands intertwined, they were as strong and unyielding as the mountains that surrounded them. This was the culmination of their journey. From the suffocating silence of a solitary house to the vibrant, messy, beautiful reality of a shared life. They had navigated the treacherous waters of fear and shame, armed with nothing but ink, paper, and a stubborn, immovable resolve to be seen. They had proven that love was not solely the domain of the delicate and the flawless, but a fierce, enduring force that belonged to those brave enough to stand in the light and say, "This is who I am." And as the stars began to pinprick the darkening sky, the woman who had once believed herself entirely unlovable leaned against the man who had once believed himself entirely unforgivable. They stood in the quiet sanctuary they had built, not out of walls and fences, but out of truth and choosing. The night was cold, but the house behind them was warm, and they were, finally and forever, home. The silence of the evening was absolute, broken only by the distant, rhythmic chirping of crickets in the tall grass. It was a peaceful sound, a stark contrast to the thundering silence of loneliness she had known for so many years. She breathed in the cool air, smelling the damp earth and the faint, lingering scent of wood smoke from their chimney. Every sensory detail felt magnified, a testament to the fact that she was truly alive, truly present in a life she had actively chosen. He shifted slightly beside her, his arm slipping around her waist to draw her closer. It was a casual gesture, born of years of comfortable familiarity, but it still sent a thrill of quiet joy through her. She rested her head against his shoulder, feeling the solid, steady beat of his heart against her cheek. This was her anchor, her safe harbor in a world that had once seemed vast and terrifyingly empty. "Do you ever think about the letters?" he asked, his voice a low rumble in the darkness. It was a question they rarely asked each other anymore, their presence so full and demanding that the past often seemed like a distant dream. But tonight, with the air crisp and the stars bright, the memory of those early, desperate days felt close at hand. She smiled against his shirt, her fingers tracing the worn fabric. "Sometimes," she admitted softly, "when the house is very quiet, or when I see a particularly beautiful sunset, I think about the man who wrote to me, the man who was so afraid of the world, but so desperate to be a part of it." "And what do you think of him now?" he asked, a hint of vulnerability in his tone. Even after all these years, a part of him still sought her reassurance, still needed to know that she accepted all the fractured pieces of his past. She lifted her head to look at him, her eyes searching his face in the moonlight. She saw the deep lines etched around his eyes, the silver in his hair, the quiet strength that radiated from him. She saw the man who had fought for her, the man who had built a life with her, the man who had never once made her feel invisible or small. "I think he was brave," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "Braver than he knew, because it takes courage to put your heart on paper and send it out into the dark, hoping someone will understand. And it takes even more courage to stand in the light and let that person see you for who you truly are." He was silent for a long moment, absorbing her words. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. It was worn and fragile, the edges frayed from years of being carried and read. He unfolded it carefully, holding it out to her. It was the very first letter she had ever sent him, the one she had written in response to his advertisement. "I kept it," he said simply, his eyes meeting hers. "I kept all of them, but this one is the most important. Because it was the beginning. It was the moment you decided to step out of the shadows and let me see you." She took the letter, her hands trembling slightly as she recognized her own neat, looping handwriting. She read the words, feeling a wave of profound tenderness for the woman who had written them. She had been so lonely, so desperate for connection, yet so fiercely protective of her own fragile heart. And he had seen past all the defenses, past the sturdy exterior, to the soft, vulnerable core beneath. "I was terrified," she confessed, her voice thick with emotion. "I almost threw it into the fire a dozen times before I finally mailed it. I thought if you really knew me, if you saw how plain and ordinary I was, you would realize you had made a mistake." He reached out and gently cupped her face, his thumb brushing away a stray tear that had escaped her eye. "You have never been plain or ordinary to me," he said fiercely. "From the moment I read this letter, I knew you were extraordinary. You just needed someone to remind you." She leaned into his touch, closing her eyes as a profound sense of gratitude washed over her. They had saved each other, in ways both big and small. They had faced down tyrants and weathered storms, but their greatest victory was the quiet, enduring love they had built from the ashes of their pasts. As they stood together on the porch, the night enveloping them in its cool embrace, she knew that their story was far from over. There would be more challenges, more moments of doubt and fear, but they would face them together, armed with the undeniable truth of their connection. They were a team, a partnership forged in fire and sealed in ink, and nothing could ever break them apart. The next morning dawned bright and clear, the sun casting a warm golden glow over the valley. They rose early as they always did, falling into the familiar rhythm of their morning chores. He went out to the barn to feed the horses, while she stayed in the kitchen, preparing a hearty breakfast of eggs, bacon, and freshly baked bread. As she kneaded the dough, her hands moving with practiced efficiency, she thought about the promise she had made him all those years ago. No more pies baked out of obligation. It was a promise she had kept, a testament to the freedom and agency she had found in their marriage. She baked now because she wanted to, because it brought her joy to provide for the man she loved. When he returned from the barn, his cheeks flushed from the crisp morning air, he paused in the doorway, taking in the sight of her standing by the stove. A soft smile touched his lips, his eyes filled with a quiet, abiding love. He walked over to her, wrapping his arms around her waist from behind and pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Smells wonderful," he murmured, his breath warm against her neck. "You spoil me." She leaned back against him, closing her eyes and savoring the feeling of his strong, solid body against hers. "You deserve to be spoiled," she replied softly. "After everything you've done for this place, for me." He turned her in his arms, his expression serious. "I haven't done anything you didn't help me do," he said firmly. "We built this life together. Every fence post, every harvest, it's all because of you." She looked up at him, her heart swelling with a love so profound it ached. He was right. They had built this life together, a true partnership in every sense of the word. They had taken a piece of derelict land and turned it into a thriving, prosperous farm, just as they had taken two broken, lonely souls and forged them into a strong, unyielding union. As they sat down to eat, the sunlight streaming through the kitchen window, casting long, dancing shadows across the table, she felt a deep sense of contentment settle over her. This was her life, her beautiful, messy, extraordinary life, and she wouldn't trade a single moment of it for anything in the world. The years rolled on, marked by the changing of the seasons and the steady, rhythmic pulse of life on the farm. They grew older, their hair turning white, their steps slowing slightly, but their love only deepened with time. It was a love that had weathered storms and faced down enemies, a love that was rooted in honesty, respect, and a profound, unwavering commitment to each other. One particularly harsh winter, when the snow drifts reached the eaves of the house and the wind howled like a banshee around the corners, he fell ill. It started as a simple cough, but quickly worsened, settling deep in his chest and leaving him weak and feverish. She nursed him with a fierce, desperate devotion, refusing to leave his side for more than a few minutes at a time. She bathed his forehead with cool cloths, brewed endless pots of willow bark tea, and read to him from their leather-bound book, her voice a steady, soothing presence in the quiet room. She read the entries they had written over the years, the chronicles of their life together, the joys, the sorrows, the quiet moments of profound connection. As she read, she watched his face, noting the deep lines of exhaustion and the pallor of his skin. Fear, a cold, sharp blade, twisted in her gut. She had spent so many years fearing loneliness, but now, the thought of losing him, of having to face the world without his steady presence beside her, was a terror she could barely comprehend. One night, when his fever spiked dangerously high and his breathing grew ragged and shallow, she sat by his bed holding his hand tightly in hers. Tears streamed silently down her face, her heart breaking a little more with every labored breath he took. "Don't leave me," she whispered fiercely into the darkness, her voice trembling. "You promised we would do this together. You promised." He stirred slightly, his eyes fluttering open. They were clouded with fever, but as they focused on her face, a spark of clarity returned. He squeezed her hand weakly, his thumb brushing across her knuckles. "I'm not going anywhere," he rasped, his voice barely audible over the howling wind outside. "I told you, I'm a stubborn man, and I have entirely too much to live for." He closed his eyes again, his breathing slowly steadying as he drifted back to sleep. She sat by his side for the rest of the night, watching over him, her heart filled with a fierce, protective love. She knew that the battle was far from over, but she also knew that they would fight it together, just as they had fought every other challenge that had come their way. Slowly, agonizingly, the fever broke. The color returned to his cheeks, his breathing eased, and the terrifying weakness began to fade. It was a long, slow recovery, one that required patience and a quiet, enduring strength. But they navigated it together, their bond growing even stronger in the crucible of his illness. When spring finally arrived, bursting forth in a riot of color and life, they walked out onto the porch together, his arm resting heavily on her shoulder for support. The air was warm and fragrant, the sound of birdsong filling the valley. They stood in silence for a long time, watching the world awaken from its long winter slumber. "I thought I was going to lose you," she confessed softly, her voice barely a whisper. The fear was still there, a lingering shadow in the back of her mind, a reminder of the fragile, transient nature of life. He turned to look at her, his slate eyes filled with a profound, abiding love. "You will never lose me," he said firmly. "Even when my body fails, my heart will always belong to you. We are bound together in this life and the next." She leaned against him, finding comfort and strength in his solid presence. She knew that he was right. Their love was not bound by physical limitations or the passage of time. It was an eternal, enduring force, a testament to the power of connection and the profound beauty of being truly, completely seen. As the years turned into decades, their story became a legend in the valley. They were the couple who had stood against the tyrant, the couple who had built a thriving farm from nothing, the couple whose love was as strong and unyielding as the mountains themselves. But to them, they were simply two people who had found each other in the dark and chosen to walk into the light together. They spent their final years in quiet contentment, surrounded by the fruits of their labor and the deep, abiding peace of a life well lived. They still wrote in their leather-bound book, their handwriting growing shaky with age, but the words as powerful and poignant as ever. They wrote of gratitude, of love, of the profound joy of sharing a life with someone who truly understood them. When the end finally came, it was peaceful, a quiet slipping away in the stillness of the night. They passed within days of each other, their bodies failing but their spirits forever intertwined. They were buried side by side in the small town cemetery, overlooking the valley they had loved and the farm they had built together. Their legacy lived on, not just in the prosperous land they left behind, but in the story of their lives. It was a story that taught generations to come the value of honesty, the courage of vulnerability, and the transformative power of a love that demands nothing less than the absolute truth. And as the wind whispered through the tall grass and the stars shone down on their quiet graves, the memory of the sturdy widow and the penitent wanderer lingered, a beacon of hope and a testament to the enduring power of being truly, completely seen. It was a love story that had begun not with a look, but with the act of telling the truth to someone who was listening, and it ended as all great love stories do, in the quiet, eternal sanctuary of a shared heart.